So I've always loved woodcuts. They're one of my favorite styles of like 1800s illustrations that you see, like pioneer era images of Ezra Meeker's Hop Farm and Puyallup, that kind of thing. So it's a style that I've always loved. So that's why I chose to do a woodcut design for my most recent beer label. It was a red IPA that turned out pretty well, and so did the label, I think. The gist of what I did was I made a design, found a piece of wood to put the design on, scooped out most of the inner parts of the design that wouldn't be raised, wouldn't be printed with ink, scooped those out with a Dremel, cleaned it up a little bit with hand carving tools, put ink on it, and then stamped that on the piece of paper that I was going to print it on, and there's your design. So it turned out pretty well, like I mentioned. As you can see, the parts of the woodcut that stay raised at the original level of the wood are going to be the parts that the ink stays on and gets pressed onto the paper with. So that's basically the idea that we're going to go with here. So I decided on, rather appropriately, the image of this stylized hop cone as the example that I'm going to show you. I did this earlier example out of a piece of particle board, but I selected another piece of nicer wood, I think it's maybe pine, off of the scrap pile. It's just big enough for the design to fit on and to have like a little handle on it while we're dremeling, because I'd rather not dremel my fingers off. But that should work out pretty well for us. So I've already sanded this down. I've already stropped my hand carving tools that we're going to clean the design up with once we've already dremeled it out. So let's get started. So first I'll be using this really small diameter bit. So after this first pass, you can see we have some pretty shallow, pretty thin grooves that we've put into this wood. And I'm just doing the inside parts of this now, inside parts of the design rather than the external parts. So my excuse for the mistakes that I make and partial rationalization is that the mistakes make it look more rustic, which definitely is what you're looking for in a woodcut, so I think that totally works. So the next thing that I'm going to do is switch to a slightly larger bit, and then use those smaller cuts that I've already made kind of as grooves and guides to help me as I'm in the kind of more perilous and detailed border parts, and then just go to town on the inside parts to scoop out a good probably 1/16 of an inch or 1/8 inch or so of wood from there. Because clearly we want to have these black parts being raised enough that the lower parts aren't printing any ink onto our paper. So you can see here I've scooped out most of the design there. You can also see that I haven't gone all the way up to the edge of the permanent marker in every place. Again, that's something that I'm going to get much closer with using hand carving tools, but you can also see that I've dug down, you know, kinda, not very deep. So I might do another pass just to kind of make sure there's enough definition there with the design. And then I'm going to scoop out outside the design right here. It's a less interesting part, so we'll just kind of blaze through that. And then afterwards we'll attack this with the hand carving tools. So I've got a pretty good amount of definition here, both on the inside and the outside of the design. And so you'll notice that there are all of these kind of, I don't know, not exactly splinters, but little messy bits poking up that are just kind of artifacts of what the Dremel did. And one of the things that I'm going to do with the hand carving tool is clean those out, but I'm also going to get a lot closer to the edges of my permanent marker here, just to make sure the actual design I'm cutting is close to what I originally intended, and also to give it a lot more kind of handmade look to it. My hand carving tool is pretty sharp. I've stropped it up to a nice gleam, but it's not perfect, and the grain of the wood and my relative inexperience with carving is going to give it what I imagine to be a pretty rustic look. Rustic being taken to be a good thing, so let's get started with that. That looks like about as much as I want to do with this hand tool. I've done enough damage, but next what I think I'm going to do is put a sanding attachment on my Dremel and just really roughly sand pretty much outside where I've carved, so there's a kind of a gap between where my design makes its print on the ink and where the remaining wood outside the design makes its print on the ink. Alright, so like I mentioned, this is just very rough. The point is that I'm just taking material away from the edges of this design. Still plenty rustic, but this should be just about what I need to put ink on it and stamp it and make a print. Okay, so I've put down some paper over top of plastic just so I don't stain my bench in case I mess up. But what I got here is a plastic dish, rubber hand roller, a spoon, and some of this water-soluble block printing ink. It's super goopy stuff. Kind of hard to work with, but I guess that's what we use for wood block printing, so there you go. So I'm just going to scoop out a fairly small amount, spread it a little bit, and it doesn't take very much to get ink on your roller. And this roller actually doesn't roll very well, so it takes a little bit of encouragement, but let's see, I'll just set this down right here. Just try to get it rolling some ink on there. And it's nice to have a fairly large dish, large flat dish to be doing this in, because in case your roller needs some encouragement like mine, that can help. So it's, again, pretty goopy on here. I'm going to see if I can get a little bit off of there. That's much better. Roll the ink on there. And you can see, just kind of like I alluded to earlier, there's this big gap between my design and the pieces of the wood block that are at the same level as the raised parts of my design here. And there's ink kind of gathering in the smaller the smaller corners of my design. But the parts that are on the most highest raised level are basically what I'm going to see in my print. Okay, so I'll set that down and get my piece of paper, lay it on here. Okay. So I'm just going to rub my design onto there, and let's see how this turns out. That's actually pretty nice. So we made 4 prints here. And all of them turned out fairly nice. Depending on what you're using them for, you could evaluate them based on whatever criteria you want. But I would consider all of these pretty nice, you know, based on my amateur experience, I suppose. This one's probably my favorite. We aren't really getting as much of the blob that we noticed on this other one right here, which is also pretty nice. You see on this one, we have some gaps up here that we'd really rather avoid. And this first one that we did has some issues with where these parts on the right of the design weren't fully getting inked in. But it's not too bad. It's a little bit more abstract, I'd say, but this one is definitely my favorite right here. But in general, I think these turned out really well.